Welcome back to Study Hall, everyone. You know we love to dig into some pretty fascinating topics, and today we're diving into the history of gender roles. We've got a ton of research, historical accounts, and get
Yeah.
ready to have some assumptions challenged. Like, big time.
It's really interesting, how we tend to think of gender roles as just kind of like set in stone, right?
Right, right.
But when you actually look at the evidence throughout history, you see how incredibly fluid they've actually been
Yeah.
and how they're influenced by so many things. Economics, religion, even the tools people use for farming, it's all connected.
I mean, okay, let's take it way back, right, to hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah.
We're talking way, way back. I
Yeah.
feel like we all kind of grew up with this, like, man the hunter, woman the gatherer kind of simplification, but
It's definitely more complicated.
there's more than that, right?
Much more nuanced. I mean, yeah, there's evidence suggesting that generally men focused on hunting and women on gathering. But it wasn't nearly as rigid as we often picture it. A great example is that recent discovery.
Oh, yeah, of a 9,000-year-old female hunter burial site in Peru.
Wow.
Talk about challenging the narrative, right?
9,000 years old. Like, that's insane. A female hunter. It really makes you think about how much of what we assume about the past is kind of filtered through our own modern lens.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's wild. But okay, let's talk about spiritual and leadership roles. Because in those hunter-gatherer societies, that gets even more interesting, right?
For sure. Like those Venus figurines we find all over the world.
Oh, yeah.
Many experts interpret them as representations of female deities.
Okay.
And it really hints at this deep reverence for feminine power in these early societies, a much more balanced dynamic than we typically imagine.
So maybe our hunter-gatherer ancestors were onto something with this whole, like, egalitarian approach, right?
Could be.
But then cue the dramatic music. Here comes the agricultural revolution.
Right.
And things start to, well, they start to shift, don't they? Big time. The shift from nomadic foraging to settled agriculture, it brought massive changes. And unfortunately, a significant step toward patriarchy.
Oh,
Like
wow.
the whole idea of land ownership.
Right.
It created these inheritance systems that really heavily favored men.
And is that because men were the ones working the land?
Yeah.
Like, is that the connection there?
Well, it's partly that, yeah. The introduction of plow-based farming, which needed, more upper body strength, it did give men a certain advantage.
I see, yeah.
But it goes beyond that. It's more about land becoming this primary source of wealth and power. And that's when you see inheritance systems popping up that prioritize male descendants.
Okay.
It was all about keeping that power within the male line.
So basically, women got kind of pushed out of the economic game, right?
To a large extent, yeah. With their economic influence waning, their social and political standing also took a hit.
Right.
Their contributions became more and more confined to the domestic sphere.
Okay.
Taking care of children, food prep, weaving, all essential, of course, but often seen as less valuable than men's labor in the fields or workshops.
It's like once land ownership became the name of the game, everything shifted. And suddenly those roles women played in a hunter-gatherer context, they weren't valued in the same way.
It's a fascinating shift.
Fascinating. Yeah, but also kind of like disheartening in a way, you know?
Yeah, I get that.
Okay, but let's jump ahead a bit. Let's look at some specific civilizations. Like we've got ancient Greece, Rome, and China.
Right?
And I feel like each one had their own unique flavor of, well, patriarchy, right?
Well, let's be careful not to oversimplify.
Okay.
Remember, ancient Greece, it wasn't a unified entity, right? Different city-states had their own distinct social structures, and that naturally led to variations in women's roles and experiences.
So saying ancient Greece was patriarchal is a little too broad of a stroke.
Exactly. It's more complicated than that. A good example is Athens. In Athens, women were essentially excluded from public life. No political rights, couldn't own property, lived under the legal guardianship of men. It was a very restricted existence.
Okay, so that's a far cry from those egalitarian hunter-gatherers we were just talking about.
Definitely. But then, on the other hand, you have Sparta.
Sparta.
Completely different story. Their militaristic society, which put a huge emphasis on physical strength, actually gave women quite a bit more freedom compared to other Greek city-states.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Spartan women could own and inherit land, manage estates, and even participate in physical training alongside men. It was pretty unique.
Interesting. But
Yeah.
even in Sparta, were women's rights truly about, like, individual empowerment, or was it more tied to the needs of the state?
That's a great question, and you're right to be skeptical. Even in Sparta, a lot of the freedoms women had were tied to the state's military objectives, like producing strong, healthy sons for the army.
Okay, so it wasn't necessarily about, like, women deserve equal rights, but more like women are valuable assets to the state.
Pretty much. Okay, now let's jump over to ancient Rome. What do you think happened there?
Let me guess. Patriarchal structures, but maybe with some slight variations.
You got it. Roman women, especially in the later Republic and during the Empire, they actually had more legal protections than their Greek counterparts.
Okay, so they were making progress.
Sort of. They could own property, initiate divorce, and engage in business.
Wow, that's pretty significant for that time period.
It was. But remember, even in Rome, those patriarchal structures remained firmly in place.
So still no voting, no holding public office.
Nope. Those doors were closed to women.
It's like this recurring theme, right? Whenever women were granted rights, it was always contingent on something else.
Yeah.
The state's needs, household demands, fulfilling those roles as wives and mothers.
It's a pattern we see over and over again. But now let's travel eastward to ancient China. And there it's all about Confucianism and how that influenced gender roles.
Okay, Confucianism. So I'm thinking hierarchy, duty, family structure, all very important in that context.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing this puts women in a subordinate position.
You're catching on fast. Confucianism, with its emphasis on social order and those 5 cardinal relationships, it really solidified a patriarchal structure.
And of course, we can't forget the famous 3 obediences.
Right.
A woman must obey her father, then her husband, then her son. Talk about a lifetime membership to the patriarchy, huh?
It was a system designed to keep women under the control of male authority figures. Limited independence, discouraged from education, minimal social and political rights, not exactly a recipe for female empowerment.
So we've looked at how different cultures kind of put their own spin on things. But it seems like this thread of male dominance, it runs through all of them.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair assessment.
But let's be real, there were always those women who defied the norms.
Always.
The rebels, the rule breakers, the ones who said, nope, not going to fit into your little box.
Absolutely. Like in ancient China, you have Ban Zhao, this amazing Confucian scholar. She actually advocated for female education.
Wow, that's pretty radical for that time.
Yeah, it was. She believed that women should be educated, not to challenge men, but to be better wives and mothers.
Okay, interesting.
And of course, we can't forget Empress Wu Zetian,
Oh, yeah?
the only woman to rule China in her own right. Talk about shattering glass ceilings.
She was a total boss.
Yeah.
An empress. I love it. So even in these seemingly rigid systems, there were always cracks where women could find a foothold, exercise their agency.
Always exceptions to the rule.
I love that. But, okay, I have to ask about religion.
All right, shoot.
How did religious doctrines, particularly in Christianity and Islam, further shape gender roles during the Middle Ages? Because I feel like those ideas were totally intertwined with the existing patriarchal structures, weren't they?
Yeah, that's a huge question. The Middle Ages, I mean, we think of chivalry and castles, but it was also a time when religion had this massive influence over daily life.
Right. Yeah,
And of course, over gender roles as well.
totally.
And Christianity in particular, it presented this kind of, well, a paradoxical view of women.
Paradoxical. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Explain the paradox.
Okay, so on the one hand, you have the Virgin Mary. She's revered, right? The ultimate symbol of purity, motherhood, devotion.
Yeah.
The ideal woman, compassionate, nurturing, deeply pious.
But then you've got Eve, the original rebel.
Exactly. And according to Christian theology, Eve's actions in the Garden of Eden, they kind of solidified this idea of women as inherently weaker,
Oh, wow.
more susceptible to temptation, and ultimately responsible for humanity's fall from grace.
So women were caught between these two extremes. The Virgin Mary, the perfect model of virtue, and Eve, the embodiment of temptation. Talk about a no-win situation.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in, and it created this incredibly narrow and, frankly, unattainable standard for medieval women. They
Right.
had to be obedient, chaste, totally devoted to their families and the church. Any deviation from that, well, you could be accused of witchcraft or moral corruption. It was serious.
And that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Were there any spaces within this system, though, where women could, like, exercise some agency? Or was it just, like, totally limiting?
There were a few, yeah. Within the church itself, certain roles offered women some degree of power and influence.
Okay, interesting.
Like nuns and abbesses, they held leadership positions within convents and monasteries.
All right.
They managed estates, oversaw the spiritual lives of their communities. They had real responsibility.
So even within these structures, there were those little cracks where women could carve out some autonomy.
Hmm.
Okay, that makes sense. What about Islam, though? How did that religion influence gender roles in this time period?
Islam's impact is complex and often misunderstood, I think. It differed from the norms in medieval Europe in some key ways.
Okay.
Islamic teachings actually granted women specific rights that were uncommon in the West.
Okay, like what?
For example, inheritance rights, the ability to own property,
Wow, okay.
things that European women at that time couldn't even dream of.
So it's not a simple case of like, oh, this religion was more restrictive than that one.
Nope, not at all. It's more nuanced than that. While Islamic law did provide some protections for women, it also emphasized men's role as protectors and providers.
Right.
And practices like veiling and seclusion, especially among the elite, they did reinforce a separation of spheres between men and women.
So it's like, regardless of the specific religion, women were still operating within a system that ultimately aimed to limit their autonomy in certain ways.
It's a common thread, yeah. But let's not forget about the impact of economics as well. Because a peasant woman's life in the Middle Ages, it looked drastically different from, say, a noble woman's life.
Oh, yeah, totally. Class always plays a role.
Absolutely. For peasant women, survival often meant contributing to the family income, which meant working outside the home.
So they weren't as confined to the domestic sphere as their wealthier counterparts?
Nope, not at all. They were out in the fields, working alongside the men, tending livestock, engaging in various crafts and trades.
Wow.
They sold goods at markets, played vital roles in their communities. They were active participants in the economy.
So it sounds like peasant women, out of necessity, had a lot more freedom and economic agency than, say, a noble woman.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. For noble women, their lives were more centered around marriage, motherhood, managing large households.
Right.
Their marriages were often arranged for political reasons, and their main duty was to produce heirs.
It's fascinating how we see this pattern repeating throughout history, right?
Mm-hmm.
Women's roles being defined by external forces, expectations, whether it's the needs of the state, the demands of religion, or just the basic economic realities of their class.
Yeah, it's this constant push and pull.
Totally. Okay, so we've got this backdrop. Now, enter the Industrial Revolution,
Here we go.
this massive societal shift. I'm curious, did it challenge those existing patterns? Or did it just, like, reinforce them in new ways?
It's a bit of both, actually. The Industrial Revolution, it was a game changer in so many ways, and its impact on gender roles was huge.
Okay, so break it down for me. How did factories and steam engines change the game for men and women?
Well, for centuries, work and home life were kind of intertwined. Families often worked together, whether in agriculture, crafts, or small businesses.
Right.
But industrialization, it created this clear separation between the public sphere of work,
Okay.
largely dominated by men, of course, and the private sphere of the home, which became increasingly seen as the domain of women.
So we're talking about that classic image of the man going off to the factory every day and the woman staying home tending to the house and children.
That became the dominant model, especially for middle and upper class families.
All right.
Working class men became the primary breadwinners, toiling in factories, mines, all those industrial jobs.
Mhm.
And women were expected to stay home, manage the household, even if economic realities sometimes demanded otherwise.
And that's where the whole cult of domesticity thing comes in,
Yeah.
right?
Bingo. This ideology, it really gained traction in the 19th century, particularly in Europe and the United States.
Yeah.
And it basically idealized women as these moral guardians of the home, emphasizing virtues like piety, purity, submissiveness, domesticity. It's all about the perfect home, delicious meals, well-behaved children, and a wife who creates this haven of peace for her hardworking husband.
It's almost like a romanticized version of like pre-industrial life, right? But now it's confined to the home, not the farm or the workshop.
It's an interesting parallel, yeah. But we have to remember this ideal was often completely unattainable, especially for working-class families.
Right, because they needed both parents working to make ends meet.
Exactly. So many women continued to work in factories, mills, all those industrial settings, even as they faced social pressure to conform to this cult of domesticity ideal.
It's that tension between ideals and practicalities again, isn't it?
Yeah, it pops up everywhere. And this tension is actually crucial to understanding the emergence of women's rights movements.
Okay, here we go.
Because as industrialization transformed society and women's roles within it, they started pushing back against those restrictive norms, demanding more equality, more autonomy.
And that brings us to first wave feminism,
Yeah.
right? The suffragettes, I mean, those women were Incredible. Fighting for their right to vote, demanding a seat at the table. It's such a powerful image.
It's a pivotal moment in the fight for gender equality, no doubt.
Totally.
Activists like Susan B. Anthony in the U.S., Emmeline Pankhurst in the U.K., they spearheaded these huge campaigns for women's suffrage.
Right.
They faced ridicule, imprisonment, all kinds of backlash, but they also advocated for legal reforms, property rights, slowly chipping away at all the barriers that kept women from owning property, entering contracts, getting a higher education.
It was a long, hard-fought battle.
Oh, absolutely. But they achieved some significant victories.
Right. New Zealand was the first to give women the right to vote back in 1893.
That's right.
Then the U.S. in 1920, the U.K. in 1928. Huge milestones.
Sure.
But I'm guessing the fight for equality didn't just end there, right?
Nope. Winning the right to vote, it's a huge step.
Yeah.
But it doesn't magically erase all forms of discrimination.
Right, of course not.
And world events, they played a big role in what happened next. I mean, think about the 2 world wars.
Okay.
Millions of men away fighting.
All right.
And it fundamentally changed gender roles, at least for a while.
Because women had to step in and do the jobs that men had traditionally done.
Exactly. They worked in factories, shipyards, offices.
Wow.
Keeping the economies running, proving they were more than capable of doing men's work.
Rosie the Riveter. Such an iconic image.
She really embodies that era.
Totally. But did those wartime experiences actually lead to lasting change? Like, did they shift people's perceptions about gender roles?
To some extent, yes. Of course, after the wars, there was this push for women to go back to their traditional roles, back to the home, back to domesticity. But those years in the workforce, they planted seeds of change. Women showed everyone they could contribute to society in so many ways, beyond being just wives and mothers.
Okay, so a pivotal moment, but not the end of the story.
Definitely not.
What came next in this evolution of gender roles? Like, where did things go from there?
Well, the 1960s brought about a whole new wave of feminist activism.
Here were you.
What we call second wave feminism. And this movement, it went beyond just legal equality. It tackled those deep-seated social and economic inequalities that women still face.
So it's not just about the right to vote anymore. It's about challenging all those ingrained social norms and expectations that limited women's choices.
Exactly. Think about Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique.
Oh, yeah.
It challenged that whole idea that a woman's only fulfillment could come from being a housewife.
Such a groundbreaking book.
It was huge. And second-wave feminists fought for so much reproductive rights, access to contraception, the legalization of abortion.
Right.
Equal pay, access to education and careers, and the right to define their own lives on their own terms.
It's such a fundamental shift in how women saw themselves and their place in the world.
It was a cultural earthquake. And while there's still so much work to do, you can't deny that the feminist movements of the 20th century, they completely changed how we think about gender.
Absolutely. I mean, we've covered so much ground here, from ancient civilizations to the suffragettes to this whole feminist revolution.
They have a lot to take in.
It is. It's amazing to see how far we've come.
Yeah.
But I can't help but wonder, what about the 21st century? What does this era hold for gender roles? Are we just continuing those trends? Or are there, like, totally new challenges and possibilities on the horizon? I mean, it feels like we're in this, like, massive cultural shift, right?
Oh, yeah.
More women in leadership roles, breaking barriers in STEM fields.
For sure.
Stay-at-home dads are becoming more common.
Yeah.
Shared parenting, a growing awareness of non-binary and transgender identities. It's like the whole idea of this fixed gender binary is being challenged like never before.
Absolutely. The 21st century, it's all about pushing those boundaries, questioning those old assumptions about what it means to be a man or a woman.
And I feel like we can't talk about this without mentioning the role of media and marketing.
Oh, totally.
Because for so long, they were, like, instrumental in perpetuating those traditional gender roles.
It's amazing how pervasive those messages were.
Yeah.
Think about those classic Hollywood movies. The damsel in distress waiting for a strong, silent hero to rescue her.
Right. Or those ads from, like, the 1950s with the perfectly coiffed housewife beaming as she scrubs the kitchen floor.
Yeah, or the toy aisles.
Oh, yeah.
Pink princess castles on one side, blue action figures on the other.
It's like we were being programmed for our roles from childhood.
It's really remarkable how much influence those portrayals have had on us.
Totally. But the good news is things are starting to change. We're seeing more diverse and inclusive representations in media and advertising.
Definitely.
Like, think about all those superhero movies with strong female leads, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel,
Oh, yeah.
Shuri from Black Panther.
So refreshing.
And even those stereotypical tough guy male characters, we're seeing more portrayals of men who are allowed to be vulnerable, express a wider range of emotions.
Totally. It's about time.
Right. And the advertising world is changing too. Campaigns that celebrate diversity, challenge those old gender stereotypes, promote a more inclusive vision of beauty.
Like Dove's Real Beauty campaign,
Yeah.
showing women of all shapes, sizes, ethnicities, or Always Like a Girl campaign, they're changing the conversation.
And even the toy industry is getting in on the action. More gender-neutral toys, encouraging kids to just explore their interests, without being boxed in by those old expectations.
It's great to see Lego sets that aren't specifically for boys or girls, Barbies with different careers and body types, action figures that embrace diversity.
It's about time.
Yeah.
And this brings us to another important development, the growing visibility and acceptance of non-binary and transgender identities.
Absolutely.
It's like challenging the very notion of that fixed gender binary, which, let's be honest, is long overdue.
Totally. Seeing more transgender and non-binary actors and characters on screen, sharing their stories, their experiences, it's a huge step forward.
And it's not just in entertainment. We're seeing it in the news, in politics, in everyday life.
For sure.
It's becoming clearer and clearer that gender is a spectrum, not this rigid either.
And all these shifts in media and marketing, they're both reflecting and driving those broader changes in society. Like we're seeing legal and policy changes that actually recognize gender diversity, protect the rights of transgender and non-binary individuals.
Gender recognition laws, workplace protections, healthcare rights. It's a movement towards greater equality and justice for everyone.
Yeah, it's amazing. And on a social level, we're seeing more inclusive language, educational reforms, even corporate policies that embrace diversity, create more equitable spaces for all.
It's really inspiring to see these changes happening.
It is.
It feels like we're at this real turning point in how we understand and experience gender.
I agree. We've come a long way from those rigidly defined roles that dictated our ancestors' lives.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the history of gender roles, what's the key takeaway here for our listeners, those lifelong learners, those curious minds out there? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Gender roles, they're not fixed. They've always been in flux, shaped and reshaped by all these social, economic, and cultural forces.
And that means we have the power to continue shaping them, right?
Absolutely.
To create a future where gender is less about limitations and more about possibilities.
Exactly. It's about recognizing and celebrating the incredible diversity of human experience, creating a world where everyone, regardless of their gender identity, can thrive and live authentically.
Well said. What a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey exploring the history of gender roles.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, keep those curious minds engaged. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep imagining that future where gender is no longer a barrier to anyone's dreams. Until next time, stay curious.